Coming up on the Threat Status Podcast, we talk to longtime U.S. diplomat Gerald Feierstein about the pivotal role Saudi Arabia will play in the Trump administration's Middle East policy and what comes next in the American military campaign against the Houthi rebels. Then we'll break down President-elect Trump's controversial cabinet nominations and dissect the bombshell House hearing about how the government has allegedly covered up a decades-old UFO crash retrieval program. Don't forget to go to WashingtonTimes.com and sign up for the daily Threat Status newsletter. Hello and welcome to the Threat Status Podcast. I'm your host, Ben Wolfgang, national security correspondent at the Washington Times, and I'm joined, as always, by my esteemed co-host, Guy Taylor, the national security editor here at the Times. The news is coming in hot and heavy this week, especially with a bunch of high-profile and controversial picks by President-elect Donald Trump for his cabinet, and we're going to dive into that here in just a few minutes. And we've also got longtime U.S. diplomat Gerald Feierstein coming up to talk about how strategically important Saudi Arabia is going to be in the Trump administration's Middle East policy for the next 4 years. But before we get to that, as always, Guy, first things first, what's on your radar this week?
Thanks, Ben. It's great to be here for another week with you on the podcast. The front and center issue for me right now is trying to get a feel from the team of officials that President-elect Trump is assembling to run his national security, intelligence, and foreign policy apparatus. So far, Trump has picked John Radcliffe for the CIA, Tulsi Gabbard for the Office of Director of National Intelligence, ODNI. He's picked Mike Waltz for National Security Advisor, Pete Hegseth for Secretary of Defense, and Marco Rubio for Secretary of State. Notably, there's no role here for Mike Pompeo, probably the most hawkish of the people in Trump's circle that everyone's waiting to see if he would be an appointment, the former CIA director and former Secretary of State in the first Trump administration. There have been calls from within MAGA world, namely from people like Joe Rogan, that Trump better not pick war hawks like Mike Pompeo for any post, and he should instead only pick non-interventionists. What it looks like right now, though, is a mixed group with some hawkish leanings, particularly toward China, and some staunch non-interventionists. I would put Tulsi Gabbard in the non-interventionist group. Presumably Hegseth is also in that group. His pick is something we all have to mull over going forward.
You know, Guy, while we're talking about Pete Hegseth, I want to drill into this specifically for a minute, because for anybody who doesn't know, Hegseth is a Fox News host, but he does have 20 years experience in the U.S. military, including tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, and he served at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba as a guard. So in terms of the post 9/11 war on terror era, he does have an impressive resume. But look, he's a TV host, so this is a far cry from defense secretaries we've seen recently, retired generals like James Mattis or Lloyd Austin, or industry executives turned service chiefs like Mark Esper. So this is an unconventional choice, Guy, to say the least. But look, I guess one of the things that I'm wondering, and a lot of people, you know, as you mentioned, MAGA world would say, does the Defense Department need an unconventional person right now at the top? And there are two sides of this argument, of course. This is a massive, massive organization. It's the nation's largest employer, active duty and reserve military, civilian employees from all over the country, all over the world, doing everything from maintenance jobs to AI research, fighting terrorists, briefing reporters, everything in between. So it goes without saying you need somebody who can manage all of that and do it effectively. But if you want to make the case for Hegseth, I think maybe it goes something like this. Institutionally, the Pentagon needs to change. We know that. Trump said in a video message this week, he wants to rebuild America's depleted military. How many times have we talked on the show about the U.S. falling behind China in key areas? In a lot of ways, they're ahead in hypersonics. They have a bigger Navy. There are all kinds of other examples we could cite. Analysts have told me on the show that the U.S. military can't fight and win a two-front war right now. And whether you want to admit it or not, things like DEI policies and the COVID-19 vaccine mandate really did erode some faith and some trust of troops up and down the chain of command in the military. So here's the big one for me, I think, Guy, is this notion of accountability. Some critics are really up in arms about the idea that a Trump administration with Hegseth at DOD could try to remove senior Pentagon civilian officials or even military officers. Hegseth himself said the Joint Chiefs of Staff chairman should be fired for being involved in DEI and woke initiatives. Is that all posturing? Maybe it is, but I don't think it's out of line to say there needs to be accountability when things like that go wrong, right?
I think, Ben, that Hegseth, you pointed out some factual things about his military background. He is a military veteran, but he is also a conservative media personality. He's on Fox, where he says a lot of things. He's also only 44 years old. I don't want to be ageist here, going the other way, but is he really ready to step in and replace Lloyd Austin or someone, a job where Jim Mattis was, as the head of the government's biggest, most expensive department? And what he's drawn the most attention for are his assertions that the U.S. military has been destroyed by wokeness during the Biden years. So we can expect that that's going to be top of his agenda. At the same time, he has also called to rename the Defense Department back to its original moniker, the War Department. These are things that have stirred a kind of hysteria in mainstream media coverage of the Hegseth pick so far. I want to point out that he's also called for a 10-year ban on generals working for defense contractors after retiring from the military. That's pretty interesting. We'll see how far he gets with that. The elephant in the room, Ben, on another front, is the pick of Matt Gaetz for Attorney General. I don't want to get into the politics of Matt Gaetz's ethics investigation or his behavior socially. What I will tell you for the threat status, our listeners to this podcast, something to take very seriously is that Matt Gaetz's brother-in-law is Palmer Luckey, the founder of the California-based defense technology giant Anduril. That's something to pay attention to. Anduril is like becoming the new Lockheed or the new Boeing when it comes to defense contracting in the advanced tech space, AI and everything else. It's just an interesting thing to pay attention to. Let me move on, though, quickly, Ben, before you interrupt me, right? With regard to Ratcliffe to the CIA, my sources in the intelligence community have said that Ratcliffe is someone with a reputation for being respectful toward the CIA. That's really different from when Trump was elected in 2016. And then a few things about Mike Waltz. While it's unclear exactly where Waltz sees the wind blowing vis-a-vis Russia, Putinism, Kremlin propaganda, and the Ukraine war, Waltz I put in the hawk camp because he has a reputation as a serious hawk on global counterterrorism operations. Waltz's wife, Julia Neshwat, was Homeland Security Advisor in the first Trump administration. Waltz was among the most outspoken critics of Biden's handling of the Afghanistan troop withdrawal. You'll remember he even introduced legislation at one point to prevent a significant troop drawdown from Afghanistan unless ODNI could certify that the Taliban would not associate with al-Qaeda. Of course, now the Taliban is in power in Kabul. The New York Times, interestingly, highlighted that as a key element in its own assessment of Waltz this week. It's almost like they endorsed him after the fact for the Post. And I think Waltz is keenly aware of the stakes of the global terrorism situation around the world. I also think he's an Iran hawk who will be closely advising Trump as national security advisor right in the White House on potential moves against Iranian proxies, Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis, and so on, not to mention Islamic State in places like Africa, where it caught my eye this week that ISIS affiliate Boko Haram carried out a major attack on a Chadian military base, and where my sources tell me that ISIS-aligned militants are poised to take advantage of post-election chaos unfolding right now in the country of Mozambique. I digress on that. I think Marco Rubio, meanwhile, is an incredibly interesting pick for Secretary of State. While Rubio has aligned his comments on Russia and Ukraine with Trump in recent months, he's also a hawk on China, and then especially on Cuba and Venezuela, two countries that other GOP hawks and centrist Democrat hawks generally say are active members of the so-called axis of authoritarians comprised of China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, and aligned around the world to try and unseat U.S. influence economically, diplomatically, militarily, as we talk about almost every week on the podcast.
The only thing to mention, I think here, Guy, to sort of put a button or a bow on all of this is Elon Musk. And because we talked a couple weeks ago on the show about what role he could play in the Trump administration, and we got an answer, at least part of an answer, which is that he's going to be leading or co-leading with Vivek Ramaswamy a government initiative to cut government waste. So it's going to be interesting to see how that pans out. But, he was also reportedly on a phone call between Donald Trump and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky just last week. Now, that doesn't seem to have a lot to do with government waste. But as we've talked about before, his Starlink satellites have been really crucial to Ukraine in its war effort, and Ukraine still needs them. So that's a bargaining chip if Trump decides to play hardball in getting Zelensky to go to the negotiating table with Russian President Vladimir Putin. So there's a lot of moving parts here. And as we predicted and have discussed on the show really for months, Elon Musk is uniquely positioned to be a pivotal figure in Trump administration 2.0.
On a totally separate front, Ben, I'm looking closely at murmurings in the Middle Eastern media and a little bit in the U.S. press, not as much, something that the U.S. intelligence community is watching very closely, and that's the immense pressure that Tehran finds itself under suddenly in the wake of the Trump election victory. The big question in Iran has to do with who will be the successor of Iranian Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, who's 85 years old and reported to be ill. The speculation is that Khamenei's oldest son, Mojtaba Khamenei, is being groomed to take over as Supreme Leader. Some reports have even speculated that Khamenei may have engineered the helicopter crash in September in which Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi was killed because Raisi was sought by other high-level clerics to be the next supreme leader, and Khamenei wanted to pave the way for his own son to replace him. That's, of course, speculation, but it's something we'll watch closely at Threat Status, and I think it factors directly into the conversation that we're about to bring you on Saudi Arabia's relevance, given that Saudi Arabia and Iran are primary rivals in the Middle East, despite attempts by China and others to portray them as coming together at this current moment of chaos in the region.
And we are joined now by Gerald Feierstein. He's the director of the Arabian Peninsula Affairs program at the Middle East Institute and a distinguished senior fellow on U.S. diplomacy. Ambassador Feierstein served all over the world more than 40 years. He was in Saudi Arabia, Oman, Lebanon, Jerusalem, elsewhere. During the Obama administration, he was U.S. ambassador to Yemen. And we can go on and on, Ambassador, with your very lengthy and impressive resume. But thank you so much for joining us here on the show.
It's a pleasure, Ben.
So I want to start, of course, with the aftermath of the U.S. presidential election and the victory of Donald Trump. Our listeners, might remember that Donald Trump's first foreign trip after winning election all the way back in 2016, which feels like a lifetime ago, but his first trip back then, foreign trip, was to Saudi Arabia. And so it was clear right from the outset, I think, that country, Saudi Arabia, was going to be potentially pretty important and maybe a cornerstone of the broader Middle East strategy of the Trump administration. So I'm wondering how you see Saudi Arabia factoring into their Middle East viewpoint this time around. A lot's changed since 2016 and 2017. How do you expect Saudi Arabia to factor into a Trump administration's Middle East policy? And given the breaking news over the past 24, 48 hours, can we get any clues from the picks of Senator Marco Rubio, reportedly to be Secretary of State, or Representative Michael Waltz to be National Security Advisor?
Those are all good questions, Ben. And to go back to the first point that you made, the centrality really of Saudi Arabia to whatever is going to shape up as the second Trump administration Middle East policy. If you look at basically three pillars of the policy in the first term, strong support for Israel. One of the key initiatives that the Trump administration took in the first administration was the Abraham Accords, this desire to promote normalization between Israel and its Arab neighbors. The focus was really on Saudi Arabia, but time ran out before they were able to complete that. One can assume that Saudi Arabia is going to be very much on the new administration's minds as far as Israel-Arab normalization is concerned. Second key pillar of the administration's policy was what was called the maximum pressure campaign on Iran. This idea that by walking away from the Iran nuclear deal that was negotiated by the Obama administration and exercising maximum military security and economic pressure on Iran, they could force Iran to abandon its nuclear weapons ambitions. Again, key to that was this coalition that existed between Israel and the Gulf Arab states. And then the third pillar, of course, was a very strong support with our Gulf allies in terms of Yemen, in terms of their internal conflict. Remember, one of the outgrowths of that first visit that you mentioned to the region was the launching of the embargo on Qatar from the other GCC states, particularly Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Bahrain, over what was perceived as Qatar's support of Muslim Brotherhood and political Islam. So in all of those three areas, Saudi Arabia was very central to the administration's position. A lot has changed over the 5 years. The events since October 7th of last year, the absolute horror in the Arab world, frankly, towards what Israel is doing in Gaza and now in Lebanon, has made proceeding with the Abraham Accords, expanding on the Abraham Accords, very problematic, probably not possible at this time. We've seen in the last 24 or 48 hours, Mohammed bin Salman himself coming out saying that what's happening in Gaza is genocide, and therefore probably in the absence of any Israeli move towards reopening negotiations with the Palestinians towards a two-state solution, which does not seem to be in the cards with this Israeli government. There's probably not going to be any Saudi advance on that. They have also, over these past 4 or 5 years, moderated their position on Iran. They've reestablished diplomatic relations.
Well, you mentioned MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, and one of the things he at the major summit in Riyadh just this week, he also, a quote that jumped out to me is, "We call on the international community to compel Israel to respect Iran's sovereignty and not attack its territory." So you take all that you just said, combined with the fact that the head of the Saudi military was in Tehran just a few days ago. How worried should we be that not only is Saudi Arabia-Israel normalization a ways off, but that actually it's swung the other way, and now we could potentially have Tehran and Riyadh getting closer together?
Well, I think that there's probably a limitation on how close Tehran and Riyadh are going to get. I don't think that the suspicions, the mutual suspicions, are gone. I don't think that the competition between the two is over. Nevertheless, I think that the Saudis and the Emiratis, there was a decision that was made in the Gulf 5 years ago, actually, while Donald Trump was still the president, that they wanted to reduce tensions in the region. They wanted to get away from the threat of a hot war with Iran, understanding that if war did break out, they were the number one target. They were ground zero for Iranian retaliation. They didn't want that. Moreover, they recognized that the real challenge to their regimes, the real number one priority for their regimes, had to be domestic economic diversification, doing something to address this demographic bubble that they've got. And if they wanted to focus on their economic development, that meant that they had to push aside the massive amounts of money that they were spending on military and security. So all of which argued for reaching out to the Iranians. The Iranians, for their own reasons, obviously reciprocated. Presumably over the next 4 years, we don't know, but presumably over the next 4 years, there is going to be a massive, massive bill that's going to come due. reconstruction in Yemen, reconstruction in Gaza, reconstruction in Lebanon. The United States is not going to foot that bill, nor is Western Europe, nor is anybody else. If there's going to be the tens or even hundreds of billions of dollars that need to be committed to reconstruction and rehabilitation of these societies, it's going to have to come from the Gulf. And there are only four countries really in the Gulf that can do that: Saudi Arabia, UAE, Kuwait, and Qatar. And one of the things that we've seen again over these past 4 or 5 years is increasing confidence in Riyadh and in Abu Dhabi, an increasing willingness to challenge U.S. leadership in the region if it means that they are going to pursue what they consider to be their national priorities, their national interests. And that means that the nature of the relationship between Washington and these Gulf capitals is going to be quite different than it was in 2016 or 2017.
One more kind of big picture question here. We talk a lot on this show about the axis of authoritarians or the axis of autocracies, or whatever nomenclature you want to use, but China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, now some would argue Venezuela and Cuba as well. We talk about that from the perspective of the West most of the time, but how does that concept play in Saudi Arabia, if at all? Do you get the sense that Saudi Arabia, do they A, recognize that this axis is forming or has formed? Do they view it as a bad thing if Iran, Russia, China, North Korea are becoming more tightly aligned? And if they do, is there a way the U.S. can leverage that to undermine that axis?
I think that another major shift over these last 4 or 5 years is the growing comfort level between Saudi Arabia, China, and Russia. And again, they're all joined together more or less. It's not formalized yet, and yet the Saudis participate in BRICS. They're very close. The Chinese, to a certain extent, I think that sometimes we exaggerate the role that China played in bringing Iran and Saudi Arabia together, but nevertheless they did. The Saudis, as you know, were reluctant to take a very firm position on Russian aggression in Ukraine. They have important economic interests with Russia. The Emiratis, Mohammed bin Zayed was just in Moscow. They participate together. They have no problem dealing with Vladimir Putin. And so I think that they don't really see these relationships within Russia, China, Iran necessarily being threatening. Saudi Arabia is not uncomfortable with an autocratic system. Their system, we used to say that their system was very much a China model, that they were focused on expanding economic opportunities for young Saudis. They certainly have made huge changes in the social makeup of Saudi Arabia, how young people, men and women, can interact with one another, can live a more or less westernized life, if you will. But the one area where they have not made any concession whatsoever is in politics. It is still absolutely verboten for young Saudis to speak out against the regime, to do anything that is seen as challenging the regime, even something that we might consider as innocent as a Twitter posting can land somebody in jail. So, the Saudis are not worried about autocratic systems. They've got one themselves.
Just to close the book on Saudi Arabia, I want to ask you about sports washing, because you and I have talked in the past about how popular professional wrestling is in Saudi Arabia, for example. And I'm a big wrestling fan. It's a constant source of controversy when WWE hosts its crown jewel events in Saudi Arabia, for which the company's reportedly paid $50 million by the Saudi government investment fund. It's not just WWE, of course, as you well know. The Saudis are deeply involved in soccer, international football. They own Newcastle United. There's the Live Golf Tour, a host of other examples of what critics would say is an attempt to paper over or minimize alleged human rights abuses and cast themselves as power players on the world stage that are involved in stuff that everyday people all over the world care about, like sports. Now, I guess what I wonder is, look, I watched WWE Crown Jewel. A lot of golfers joined the Live Tour. People still go to Newcastle United matches. So, maybe we're all hypocrites to an extent, but has this strategy of sports washing, if you want to call it that, has it worked, Ambassador?
Yeah, I think so, and we should not ignore the fact that Coco Gauff just won the WTA championship in Riyadh just a couple of days ago. Look, I think that the Saudis had a number of different motivations. We call it sports washing because clearly one of the motivations is that they wanted the world to be talking about Saudi Arabia in a way that was different than what it used to be. They didn't want to only be the world's gas station. They didn't only want to talk about the monarchy and repression of people. They wanted to talk about other things. And that was certainly part of it. The other part of it is that they wanted to portray to their own population the fact that Saudi Arabia was changing, and that they wanted to be able to bring to Saudi Arabia some of these events that Saudis used to travel around the world to see. And part of it is financial. Part of it is that they wanted Saudis to spend their tourism dollars in Saudi Arabia and not in Egypt or Orlando or London. And so, by bringing these events, and again, it's not only sports, it's also music, it's also all these other kinds of activities. Part of it is domestically oriented. They wanted to demonstrate to their own population that they're accepted around the world, and a part of it is financial and internal competition. We shouldn't leave aside the fact that an awful lot of this, when the Qataris got to host the World Cup, that started a ball rolling that all of these other guys wanted to host some of these big premier global events as well. So there's also an internal GCC kind of competition that's going on here.
Right. Ambassador, last thing to close out here. You served as U.S. ambassador, as I said earlier, to Yemen during the Obama administration. So you know the country better than just about anybody. I'm curious how you would characterize the U.S.-led air campaign against the Houthis in Yemen, which is now coming up, believe it or not, almost going on for a year almost. Does it worry you that there aren't any clear metrics for declaring victory and ending that campaign? Because one of the things I worry about is, do you think there's a chance that Donald Trump might come in and say, this looks like a potential forever war in the making, and there's no clear indications when it would end, so I'm just going to pull the plug and get out? So I guess two questions. Number one, do you think it's been a success so far? And number two, are you worried that it could just get chopped off and ended prematurely during a Trump administration?
I think that the air campaign has served a largely defensive purpose. People who think that they're going to be able to force the Houthis to give up on the strategy of interdicting shipping in the Red Sea and the Bab el-Mandeb through air are living in a fantasy world. They're not going to do that. They're not deterring the Houthis. And in fact, what we've seen over this past year is really Houthi capabilities growing, not retreating. So I think that the U.S. military, with our coalition allies, needs to keep doing what they're doing, because it's the only way of preventing this from getting worse. I think that they need to continue to do what they can to protect international shipping in the Red Sea. But the only solution to what's happening with the Houthi campaign is to end the conflict in Gaza. We're not going to deter. Some people talk about, well, CENTCOM really wants to go beyond where they are now, wants to be more aggressive than they are now. I don't see that there's anything that we're going to do that's going to change the dynamic. We are certainly not going to put U.S. boots on the ground in Yemen. I think it would be absolutely insane. Certainly not during a Trump administration. I would say not in any administration. It would be absolutely nuts to think that that's a good idea. Somebody was saying, well, we'll coordinate with the Saudis on a more aggressive campaign. Well, the last thing that the Saudis want, frankly, is a more aggressive campaign. They want to get out from under the Yemen conflict. They want to see an end to it. They don't want to see it expanded. They don't want to see the Houthis start targeting their oil facilities or their civilian infrastructure as they were doing before. I don't think that there's any desire on the part of Saudi Arabia to see us take a more aggressive position. I think that we need to continue to do what we're doing, understanding that the results are going to be very limited. We're not going to solve the problem. We're only going to manage the problem. And then the solution is lies elsewhere.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you so much for joining us here this week. Really appreciate it.
It's always a pleasure, Ben.
And it's time now for Threat of the Week. It's our weekly segment here on the show where Guy and I each identify a threat, whether it's here at home domestically or in some corner of the world that we think is affecting you, impacting national security, U.S. national security right now this week. So, Guy, what do you have for us for your Threat of the Week?
My threat of the week, Ben, is that there will be another massive conflagration in the Mideast between now and the Trump inauguration in January as Iranian proxies and perhaps even U.S. ally Israel seize on the moment of relative organizational transition and chaos in Washington and the U.S. media to push red lines and escalate against each other. Such an escalation is potentially very dangerous right now. And it's my threat of the week because it could shift the global geopolitical picture between now and when Trump takes office at the end of January.
Yeah, that's something we're going to keep a very close eye on here at Threat Status, obviously. Guy, my threat of the week is secrecy around UFOs or UAP, unidentified anomalous phenomena, depending which term you personally prefer to use. I think it's time for the secrecy to end, and I'll explain why in a minute. But longtime listeners might remember that UFOs were my threat of the week all the way back in March on one of our very first episodes where I talked about how surreal it was that an official Pentagon report pushed back in detail against allegations that the U.S. has made contact with aliens, recovered UFOs, and is reverse engineering extraterrestrial technology. Well, this week brought a moment that was just as surreal, if not more so. I covered a hearing before two subcommittees of the House Oversight Committee focused on UAP and the government's alleged cover-up of information about it. This was just amazing. There were serious discussions in public, on the record, at a congressional hearing about whether the U.S. has communicated with alien life, whether UAP are controlled by interdimensional beings, whether unidentified objects at sea could have secret alien bases below the surface of the ocean, and yes, let's not forget whether the U.S. government has been secretly storing extraterrestrial bodies, alive or otherwise, at off-the-books military sites such as Area 51. This is incredible. At least I think so. Not even 5 years ago, Guy, I would not have believed in a million years that this stuff would make it in front of a congressional hearing. But in some ways, it's a reflection of where our society is today. People are more prone to believe what some would call conspiracy theories, or I guess to be more precise, people are more willing than perhaps ever before to believe that their government is lying to them. That's kind of where our society is. It's kind of where our government actually is going to in some ways. You have opponents of the so-called deep state very skeptical of government agencies, the CIA and the military, nominated for key positions in the incoming Trump administration. And hey, by the way, there might be some truth to all of this as well. Tim Gallaudet, a retired Navy admiral, he testified at this week's hearing that in 2015, when he was commander of the Navy's Meteorology and Oceanography Command, his personnel in the Theodore Roosevelt Carrier Strike Group witnessed unidentified objects in the sky. This was an incident captured in the now famous Go Fast video. If you haven't seen it, go Google the Go Fast UAP video. It's fascinating and somewhat frightening to see. But immediately after that happened in 2015, Gallaudet told Congress on the record that the Navy informed him of their encounters via email. And he said, quote, "The very next day that email disappeared from my account without explanation," unquote. Could he be lying? I guess so, but it sure didn't seem like it to me. He's about as credible as they come in terms of background, military experience, and resume. So that's why it's my threat of the week this week. This is only going to get worse quickly. Today in America, people want to believe that the government is hiding major humanity-altering secrets from them. They want to believe that the government's lying, and to some people that the government might just be downright evil. So I think we need a major information dump by the Defense Department and the intelligence community on this issue. There is a record somewhere of what happened with that email that Tim Gallaudet says was mysteriously deleted so that nobody would ever talk about this incident again. Why don't they come out and explain what happened there? That could go a long way to restoring some faith of Americans in their government, because otherwise, I do think this is an issue that could really undermine what's left of Americans' faith in their government over the next few years. Thank you all so much for listening this week. Thank you, Guy. Big thanks to Gerald Feierstein for joining us here on the Threat Status Podcast. Please go ahead, hit that subscribe button, share with all of your friends, and Guy and I will be back next week.